John Clark was a Baptist minister who went to England and basically camped out in the palaces and realm of Charles II, pushing for freedom of religion for this little colony on the other side of the world. And he must have been very persuasive, because he succeeded in getting an agreement from Charles II that Rhode Island would be able to practice religion free of any constraint, even that of future monarchs. So that probably never happened before. Monarchs are typically not good for taking things outside of their control. But anyway, he then returned with this charter, which is on display in the Rhode Island State House. And it made Newport one of the freest places in the entire world at that time, with perhaps the exception of Amsterdam. But in terms of concentration of different religions practicing freely together, there was no equivalent in that early colonial period. You have to remember, up in Boston at this point, they were still hanging Quakers, and those many people were fleeing not just from Europe for religious freedom, but were fleeing from other states. And so that had, of course, a very important impact on our architecture, because many of the early founders were merchants, many of Quaker descent, and one of them was named Nicholas Easton. He bought a tract of land which was called Easton's Point at that time, now just known as the Point. And you're going to see in some maps why that was called the Point when it doesn't seem like there's any points down there. There were at one point, and that all changed over time. But you'll notice many of the names that you see: Cogshell, Bull, Easton, Brenton, Clark, Hutchinson, Coddington. Those are still names we're very familiar with today, more from local roads or geographic features. But these were the men who, in pursuing the opportunity to practice their religion, gravitated to this early colony, this outpost, and it started to grow very precipitously. And when people ask when were Newport's best days, the native Newporters say, before the war, the Revolutionary War, to explain just how long their familial roots go down here. And that was really a golden era for Newport. We were a thriving trading port right off the Atlantic Ocean. Deepwater port allowed large ships to come in but be protected from storms. And the religious freedom that John Clark, through his charter, was able to establish allowed Newport to thrive in a kind of unfettered way that no place else was really growing at that colonial period. Here's a map of Quinnic Island just before the Revolution. And you can see there are a few little outposts like Providence up there, but when they called Newport Rhode Island Providence Plantations, Rhode Island was a Quinnic Island. We were the Rhode Island of that. And then the Providence Plantations got second billing because the growth was really happening here. And then as it grew, we became known more as a Quinnic Island. one of the most important and early architectural icons of the Point area. And you have to remember that the Point, before America's Cup cut through it, bisected it, was really that whole flat section, including the area just to the north of Washington Square. And that whole area was filled with small houses and then leading to surrounding this meeting house, which was the Quaker Meeting House, first begun in 1699. And you see a model of what it looked like. Let's see if my pointer, I've got kind of a super weak pointer here. Anyway, you can see on the left side the structure of this barn-like structure, and you can still see that when you go in today, the heavy timbers, the purlins. And it's around this building and around this location that the Quaker community grew both in size and in wealth. And here you see the next little addition in 1720, and then it lost that large cupola by 1880, and you see it taking on some almost Greek-like qualities. So following the architectural development of the area, this one building, in a way, is its own thesis of architectural evolution as things developed. But you still see many of the original heavy timbers and purlins and structure are still present in the building as it is today. And you can go in there, and there are basically two sets of pews. The religious service was a very quiet one, with people coming and sitting quietly, contemplating for hours. I'm not sure in a world where we have an attention span of about 5 seconds, that type of religion would be as popular today. And in fact, I think the Quaker community has largely left Newport, even though it was one of the major Quaker centers during the colonial period. Much more typical, but also of similar character in terms of the heavy timbers being hewed out of wood. And back then, you didn't generally hire a contractor. You and your friends and neighbors would go out into the woods and cut a tree and haul it in and take an adze and kind of square it off and stand it up. It was a labor of love, blood, sweat, and tears. And so one thing you're going to see in the Point section is very little demolition. You don't take one of these houses after somebody has crafted all of these parts and pieces that fit together like a Japanese puzzle and let that be destroyed. You take it down, you relocate it, you lift it, you move it. You'll see some of the houses that we'll talk about have now been moved 3 times because they were just too valuable from what we call an entrained energy standpoint. There's the energy that goes into any building to make the steel or the concrete or the wood, but there's also the human energy to shape those components and put them together. And that's something that, from a sustainability standpoint, we are very focused on today as architects, but they, back then, were even more so because every piece of wood had to be shaped by their own hands, their own energy. There was no real mechanization to allow that. In the northern realm, of which we certainly fall, the standard colonial house centers on a large masonry chimney, which serves as the heating and cooking for the house, and then the building surrounds it so that that element will be used throughout the day in all of the rooms that are occupied and radiate that heat into the spaces where it's desperately needed. They didn't really have great insulation. They could use sheep's wool and other materials, but many of these houses that we've seen over time were basically completely without insulation. So they were maybe 10, 20, maybe 30 degrees warmer than whatever the outside temperature is. So you wore a lot of coats. You basically lived like you were out of doors all the time, even when you were in a house. But having this large central masonry component, which would heat up as fires cooked and then radiate that heat out throughout the day, is a model that you will see not just here in Newport, but throughout the Northeast in terms of colonial architecture. Here is one of the very early houses in the Point section called Old Nat's House, dating to approximately 1717. And you see it's very compact. It's basically 2 bedrooms. And that was a palace to somebody at that point. You know, just having a place out of the cold was incredibly valuable. There was no kitchen because the fireplace was the kitchen. And you see the prominence of wood in American architecture. In England and other countries, they had 1,000 years of cutting trees down to the point where those continents were largely denuded of wood, whereas in the United States or the American colonies, you had vast, untold forests of trees, often many cedar, which turned out to be a great cladding material for the exterior of these buildings. Often you'll see they'll use clapboard on the front to provide a kind of a finished decorative feature. So even in the most practical, even in the smallest of houses, you'll see that desire to elevate the building in terms of design, in terms of symmetry. They all tended to be very symmetrical. And then around the sides, they would use the split cedar shake, and then, of course, split cedar shake on the roof, as is the case here. And another kind of practical feature you'll see a lot in the Point is the gambrel style roof. It provided a way in which to put a roof on a house, but not have that space just be an attic or too low to be used. So it goes up very steeply at the sides, and then has a more shallow roof across the top, and that allows that whole space to be used, particularly when you add a couple of dormers like they've done here. So you have an extremely compact but smartly designed building that not only served Old Nat, whoever he was, and we only know him by the name of the house that he left behind, but all of the generations since. Somehow, someone in the not just the 18th century, but the 19th century, the 20th century, and even the 21st century, have found this to be a practical, comfortable place to live. Just across the street from that is the Christopher Townsend House, which now has been elevated. So we're talking about issues of technology. Well, now we're even talking about issues of environmental sustainability, changes to the global environment that is causing water to rise. Nothing could be more broad-minded in terms of its reflection on the world than architecture that is dealing with environmental issues. So among the Quakers were the Townsend and Goddard families. They were craftsmen of the first order. They made bureaus and highboys, and often with this very unique shell motif that has been copied by many others. These pieces of furniture sell for tens of millions of dollars. So if you happen to have one in your basement, take good care of it. The Metropolitan Museum would like to talk to you about acquiring it. But they were made not just for the wealthy in America, but they were actually being imported back to Europe. They were of such high quality, which is pretty remarkable, because really, during the colonial period, the United States, what would become the United States, was really just an outpost, a place to cut timber, find fur, and mine materials and bring that back to Europe in commodity form, not in a fine, finished, crafted form like this. So you have a sense of the detail, and you'll see much of the same elegance and detail in the architecture. So like many houses, that is the smallest, saddest little pointer ever. But this was the main house, and this was the studio here. So you didn't get in your car and commute 20 minutes to Warwick to do your work over at Quonset. You went through a doorway and you were in your shop doing your work right there in the point section. So everything was integrated together. It's a true live-work type environment, which we seem to be migrating back to thanks to Zoom and remote working and all of that. So it's interesting how cycles complete themselves and repeat. So anyway, you'll see a lot of the Townsends and the Goddards had houses, brothers, cousins, whatever, throughout the point section. A very important house that sits on Washington Street is the Hunter House. And the Hunter House really was the mansion of its day. It was owned by a trader, somebody who kept ships, and it had two front doors. One front faced Newport and Washington Street, what was originally called First Street and was only later named. The Quakers did not believe in elevating human beings, so things were named first, second, third in one direction. In the opposite direction, they were named after trees, and that has remained to this day, with the exception of First Street, which was renamed Washington Street after the death of Washington in 1799. And on the other side, you have another front door, and that's the front door to the ocean. And there were no bridges. Everything arrived by boat. Everything departed by boat. Long Wharf was the center of mercantile life in Newport at that time. And so this had a large dock going out, and his boats would be parked there. And in between trips, coming and going from faraway places, bringing things, and then perhaps even taking some things, as we talked about. The Townsend Goddard furniture was one such thing that was worthy of being exported to other markets, both in the colonies and back to Europe. But it's an interesting way in which the house has two front doors in the same way that Newport had two front doors, one to the ocean and then one to the Middletown and Portsmouth and the places where sheep and cattle and grain and all other materials were just being grown. So this is where those two worlds really meet, architecturally and economically. The front door, you see the beautiful craftsmanship, that same craftsmanship you saw in the Townsend Goddard furniture. you see in the beautiful broken pediment at the Hunter House. And at the top, you see the pineapple, maybe not the best photograph of that, but the pineapple was a symbol of hospitality, of graciousness. It's kind of a funny thing because obviously we don't grow pineapples here. They come from the Caribbean. And so if you brought a pineapple back on one of your journeys and hung it outside your house, that meant, one, you were back safely. Two, you had been successful because you had something that probably had the value in today's terms of about $6,000 to $8,000, a perishable fruit sitting outside of your house. And that was used to basically welcome your friends, family, and neighbor to your house and let them know that you were back and that you had been extremely successful in your journeys. And that pineapple became a long-standing symbol of welcome and hospitality, certainly in Newport, but also in other colonial port cities that had similar reactions to it. That pineapple has recently been removed, refinished, painted, and put back, and it's looking spectacular. Again, we talked about the gambrel style. So even in a large, so about a 3,500, 4,000 square foot house, which by today's standards is very modest, but back then was truly palatial when you put it in context of the 1,200 square feet of old Matt's house, which is right around the corner from this. In comparison, this was a very grand affair indeed. But still not so grand that they didn't want to use that same gambrel roof, which provided that extra level of livability on the third floor. But you can see here with the balustrade up top, this is purely decorative. There's no practicality. It's not a widow's walk. It's hard to get up there, but it's a sort of a decorative crown for the building, establishing this as more than just a generic pedestrian structure in which to live. It really has its goal of establishing itself as a work of architecture in this thriving colonial community that was Newport. Here's the central hall. This is where they would greet people, and you see it's quite wide, beautiful wood paneling. Again, not surprising with all of these amazing woodworkers creating this stuff, and a beautiful arch in the middle at what we call the center stick. So the structure is broken in half with a very large, heavy element down the middle, like a spine, so that the span is cut in half, and that produces 1/4 the bending moment of a structural element that would be traversing the whole thing. So again, practicality and beauty being wedded together into the elements of this. And the outside of the building continued to kind of decay and fall apart, but the interior was very beautiful. And the point section by the 1930s and 40s had fallen pretty far, and the Metropolitan was going to acquire the interior panels of this house and relocate them to New York, reset them up as a display. And it was for that reason that Catherine Warren, Ralph Carpenter, and some other people kind of joined together and said, we want to keep this building here in Newport, and this is the reason why the Preservation Society of Newport County was founded, was to keep this property intact, to fix it up on the outside, but to keep it from being sold and destroyed forever. Okay, here we have an example of the various elements of a late Georgian style building. One thing that you'll see is these dormers going from peak to round to peak to round. That's very typical of the late Georgian style. You see that this building here, which is a brick house down in Virginia, is a little different than what we're going to see in a moment. The southern colonial houses, unlike the northern ones that had that strong central masonry core, they would move their fireplaces out to the side because they wanted to actually exclude the heat. You know, in the long, hot summers, they did not want the cooking to heat up the rest of the house, unlike the northern New England houses, which could handle it fine. And so they typically had their chimneys on the exterior of the building. And they would also have, certainly down in Philadelphia, in Boston, in Charleston, they had a lot more clay. We have very little, and so bricks were much more of a localized phenomenon down there. Here, if you saw a building made of brick, it meant that all of that brick had to be imported from somewhere else at tremendous expense and difficulty, and then carried wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow to the site. And so brick establishes a building as having a very special purpose or character in comparison to all of the wood architecture that was very typical of our development during the colonial and post-colonial periods. Okay, so here we have the Pitt's Head Tavern. Again, in its lower state, it's now in the act of being elevated 8 feet because the flood level of the point is right about here, 8 feet. And so if you want to protect the building, you have to lift it up above that and figure out how to get up there. And so all of the houses on Bridge Street now are undergoing similar transformation. This house was originally in Washington Square, I believe where the Bank Newport building was. And when time came to build a much fancier neoclassical building like the Bank Newport building, the old structure, instead of being demolished, as it would have been many other places, was simply lifted and moved whole down to the point section to an empty site that was found there. So that was its first big move, and now its second big move is being elevated vertically about 8 feet. All right, here we have the famous Blaskowitz map of 1777. And what is interesting is to remember that in 1776, Newport was the 5th largest city in America. And people are like, what? That's crazy. Well, we were very successful. The whole Midwest was yet to be discovered. Chicago probably had about 10 people in it at that time. And you see here this promontory of rock, and that was Easton's Point. This is Long Wharf here, which connects to Washington Square, and there's the Colony House right at that point there. And this is right there, the Brick Market, which we'll see in a minute, I think. But this whole area here, this is Marsh Street, and now you know why Marsh Street is called Marsh Street, because it was next to a big marsh. But back then, there was no waste management to come pick up your stuff and ship it up to some other place that we'll never see. Most people took their trash and debris and other stuff and walked it right into this area here and dumped it. And over time, it filled with construction debris and other stuff until it filled in. And that became the area where the bus station and the Marriott are located. And unfortunately, they only filled it up to a certain degree. So when there are floods, that area tends to flood very quickly because they never took the extra effort to bring it up above the level of the water, which is where it essentially is right now. So it's interesting that this plan that we see from 1777 is very much the plan we see when there's a big flood event like Hurricane Sandy or something like that. The water tends to return back to its natural places of repose. But also you see how the point really was connected right across, and there's the meeting house there, and everything connected back to Thames Street here. So this is kind of Main and Main, and Historic Hill at that time was still largely kind of in development. In 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was read from the steps of the Colony House, Newport had about 10,000 people. About half of those people left in anticipation of the Revolutionary War. And they were quite right, because the British wanted and needed a deep water port like Newport. And by December of 1776, they had invaded and taken over the city and claimed it for themselves. Half the people stayed, and many of them were loyalists or just had nowhere else to go, and half of them decamped to places like New Haven, Boston, elsewhere, which were stronger footholds for people who were maybe not as convivial with the idea of British rule. Not only was Newport a great place to have deep water ships, it was also a great place to create a military foothold, because you see here, and this is a diagram of from 1780, showing how from various locations, and from Goat Island to what is now known as Rose Island, they could create a phalanx of cannon fire that would prevent anything from passing north towards the city of Providence along the East Passage. And these would be barracks for the British troops. Many of the houses that were left abandoned by the people leaving Newport were used for barracks. The more derelict ones were used for firewood. It's much easier to tear a house down than go to the woods and cut a tree down and drag it in. So unfortunately, the 2 years, the year and a half between December of 1776 and July of 1778, when the British held Newport, were a very, very, very tough time for Newport. As we said, half of its population dropped. Many of the houses were lost. 3/4 of the volumes of the Redwood Library disappeared mysteriously. I'm actually surprised any were left at all, because books had such tremendous value at that point, and that was being used as an officers' club for the British military. But fortunately, much did remain, and the city was not burned down. It was left intact, and so Newport had this core of beautiful colonial architecture that was the envy of any other city along the East Coast, with perhaps the exception of Charleston. After the Revolution, there was another form of architecture called federal, which looked exactly like Georgian, except wherever there was a crown in the interior, that was substituted by an eagle. So there wasn't really that much difference between the Georgian style and the federal style, except in some of the symbols that were used. It tended to have a flat roof. It had a colonnade around it, very much like some of the Georgian architecture. There is the Museum of Furniture that they used to have down on Thames Street for the NRF is a good example of that. But in the point section, there really isn't any. So we kind of skipped over that for the purposes of this lecture. But there is a lot of Greek Revival architecture. And this came from studies. They were groups uncovering Herculaneum and Rome and other things. Of course, obviously, some of the architecture of that period had always existed and through to the present day. But it has largely been forgotten, many of it destroyed. There was a revival, particularly in the United States, because the Americans had thrown off this idea of a God-given king with powers above and beyond that of any other human being, and relocated that power among all the people, which is sort of what they had in Rome and sort of what they had in Greece. There were a lot of slaves and women that didn't have the vote, but we'll leave that to the side for the moment. It was definitely a time and place of greater equality, especially among the well-educated and elite. And so as America was looking around the world and through history to try and find an architecture that it could relate to, it gravitated very quickly to the Greek and Roman cultures. And so you'll start to see the elements of the pediment, which is this triangular element here, and columns, and turning that pediment from the side to the front. So often the carpenters knew how to build a certain kind of building, both the gambrel and the gable, and they tended to do it so that the building was turned to the side. Well, when this new idea of Greek Revival came, they said, oh, well, all we have to do is we'll just turn the house 90 degrees and we'll emphasize that same roof line that we already had, and it will start to at least begin to emulate the temples of Greece that are now being uncovered and documented in various archaeological journals. So from basically like 1825 to about 1880, you'll see an awful lot of this Greek Revival architecture throughout the United States, but definitely in places like Newport, where building was just beginning to happen again. One of the reasons we have so little federal architecture in Newport is in that period after the war, other places like Philadelphia and Boston and Charleston were thriving. Newport was kind of stuck in neutral. And there is lore that the school children of 1830 were all heralded out of their schools and taken to see a new building going up, which is the first one to be built in Newport in 20 years around that time, because it had been a period of such economic stagnation and recovery from its time and place in the Revolution that there was an excess of building. People could find an old house and purchase it very easily because there were so many of them. So you see, here are two kinds of Greek Revival. The very simple gable turned to the street with the pediment across, not rounded, but just square posts serving as the columns, or like Bill Height's house on Pelham Street, a much more elaborate colonnaded house with a real emphasis on emulating the Greek temples more carefully, often by putting in one of the 5 forms of column, which are Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and composite, and Tuscan. Tuscan's the most basic of the 5. So here we have a house that looks like a lot of houses in the point section, but you see the emphasis of creating that pediment-like feeling. There's really no reason to bring this frieze board all the way across, except that then it creates that triangle element that emulates the kind of high-style architecture that was going on elsewhere, and some very simple columns. Well, if there's one constant in architecture, it is change, because people get tired of whatever has being done, and they want to put their own spin on things. They want to have things look a little bit different for themselves, just to show their own level of personality. And they decided to apply that and take some other architecture from Europe, but more of the Italianate style that they were seeing on their grand tours of Europe. And you have to remember at this point, people like Richard Morris Hunt and Charles Follen McKim were Americans that went over, studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, traveled along with the well-to-do young men of Britain and France who were traveling through Italy and Greece, doing sketches, falling in love with these forms that they were finding, and then bringing those forms back to the United States and applying them as a mark of their sophistication, of their erudition, the fact that they'd done what they call the grand tour, studying the ancient works of architecture of Europe, and then taking that knowledge and applying it back here in the United States. The Italianate style, you'll often see, it's a very kind of blocky structure. It will often have a steep pyramidal roof. Often there'll be a cupola at the top. The windows frequently are what they call Romanesque, which means there's a perfect half circle at the top. Sometimes you'll have 2 of them applied. If you see the King House that you're probably all familiar with, that is one of the purest forms of Italianate style architecture in the United States, and was published in books as a model which had been probably copied hundreds, if not thousands of times elsewhere in the US. So if you ever want to see Italianate style architecture in its purest form, that's a great building to look at. But you have something very similar here at Harbor House, designed by Richard Upjohn. Richard Upjohn, who is the designer of the King House, very skilled in Italianate architecture, built this house here for the Auchincloss family, and it was then later combined with these other structures to create I believe, a convent, and then that convent was converted into independent living that it is today. But you see here, this building, again, is a wonderful example of all kinds of different architecture. It's gone through a series of functional uses, and it represents the evolution of the financial elements of the point, and that's then therefore reflected also in the architectural elements. Gothic revival is something that is very of the same period. Gothic and Italianate kind of came up together. Not surprisingly, Richard Upjohn, who designed the George Noble Jones House, which was renamed the King House when it was sold from a southern family to a northern family. That's in the Gothic revival style. And the building right next to it, which he also designed, is in the Italianate style. So you can see that they were of the same period. Often the same architects were working in both those styles simultaneously. The rise of Gothic architecture was largely a philosophic thing tied back to A.G. Pugin, who was writing and saying, all of this new architecture is so godless, and we need to get back to our Christian roots, and we need to restore these magnificent cathedrals that we find in Europe, and we need to revive that. And so that cycle was happening at that time. And so for about a 20 or 30 year period, Gothic, and of course the American Gothic with, Grant's farmer and his wife standing, looking not very happy in front of a clapboard, steep-roofed building, was extremely popular in the United States, not just in New England, but throughout the entire country, as this kind of philosophical movement swept through and then impacted the architecture of those places. So here we have a wonderful example of Gothic revival style, which is the St. John's Episcopal Church. This is designed in 1894, which is a little bit after the Gothic style had been kind of reached its peak in the residential architecture. So I believe, for instance, Kingscote, the George Noble Jones House was, I believe, designed in the 1840s, 1845, for a southern plantation owner from Charleston. And that was really kind of more the center of the Gothic revival in residential architecture. But obviously, in church architecture, it had a longer run because the Gothic had such a natural character and quality, since many of the Gothic works that Americans were studying were churches. Naturally, they applied that same design, the tower, the steep roof, stone structure, all of the various things that are called out here. Elaborate frieze boards, etc., were a perfect application for this work of architecture, which really anchors the Point neighborhood and also sits on Washington Street. The original church, okay, here we are in the interior, beautiful, heavy timbers. You really feel like you're maybe in the 18th or 17th century, somewhere in England, in a country church. When you see Father Brown and other English shows on TV, something like this looks very, very familiar to you, because these were like the country churches that were occurring throughout the English continent. The interior beautifully crafted out of heavy structural elements. Another style of architecture that was very popular and followed this sort of European influence, a re-influence on the United States, is the Second Empire style. So quite a few buildings down in the Point section that fall into this category. The main thing that you will use to recognize the Second Empire is the mansard roof, which is sort of a parallel to the gambrel, but instead of being extruded and having a flat end at both, it takes that sloped roof and carries it all the way around the house to utilize the area up top, but also to create an architectural feature, a crown to these houses. So if you go down the Champs-Élysées, you'll see mansard roofs all the way down, and they are tie back to Mansard, who was the architect of Louis XIV's, and a very dominant architectural figure in Europe. It took us about 200 years to pull his style to the U.S., again, largely through people like Richard Morris Hunt, who was studying in France, seeing the mansard architecture that existed there, working on the Louvre and other things, becoming very familiar with that. And also George Champlin Mason, a Newport born and bred architect who also traveled in Europe and practiced pretty much exclusively in the United States. He also took on that Second Empire style as his own and applied it again and again and again throughout the many, many buildings he built, not just in the Point, but elsewhere around Newport. Okay, so here we have Stella Maris of 1871, also known as Villa Edna, which is also the name of the Isaac Bell House, so it's very confusing, so we don't call them by that name anymore, because I guess there were a lot of Ednas around at that time. And so the stone architecture, you see, it's a little hard to see. There's corbels under this. There's the steep sloping roof, interrupted, highly symmetrical. Stone is a nice extra level of detail above and beyond the clapboard, which would be typical of the American Second Empire. Again, it has much more of a kind of a European flavor in comparison to the architecture that came before. Also, grander in scale. You see that America is becoming more wealthy. These are tending to be second houses for people from Boston and New York that are traversing here by steam ferry. You see this is in the period just before 1880. 1880 is a kind of a banner year for Newport, where two very important things happened. One, the Newport Casino was completed, and so all of the independently wealthy residents suddenly had a place to gather together, and that kind of stimulated the idea of community among that group. And secondly, Mrs. William Backhouse Astor, known as the Mrs. Astor, Caroline Astor, Lena, if you're watching The Gilded Age, decided to follow her uncle up and purchase Beechwood and begin additions to that. But where she went, people followed, and so large numbers of people from New York who wanted to be admitted to her circle decided that they too needed to buy houses in Newport and either purchase the large ones that existed or renovate and build new ones. Here we have a very important work of architecture, the J.N.A. Griswold House. This is a model. This is perhaps the stick style model developed by Richard Morris Hunt, who was part of the kind of outer American aristocracy. His father was a congressman from Vermont. When he was 5 years old, his father died prematurely, and his mother, who had an artistic bent and had enough money from the sale of their Vermont home, relocated the family first to Rome and then to Switzerland, where they studied and prepared to enter into the École des Beaux-Arts. And both Richard and his older brother William studied there, became noted architect and painter, respectively, and then returned to the United States to bring all that knowledge that they brought. But one of the things they brought was this sort of articulation that had elements of the Tudor style. Well, in Europe, these vertical components would have been actual structural components, and the infill would have typically been done in either wood or stone or brick, because there just wasn't enough wood to cloak an entire house like this. It would have been used just for the heavy structural elements, which would have been present and visible on the front, and everything in between would have been infilled with some sort of masonry. Well, here, those structural elements are completely decorative. They're just applied to the outside, but they have a design style. And you'll also see, although it's, again, I apologize for the photograph taken on a dark day. You'll notice that here, although this is not by Richard Morris Hunt, it's certainly emulating the other architecture that he was creating here in Newport in the 1860s and 1870s, like the J.N.A. Griswold house. You see the same sticks applied here. It's a little less decorative. The clapboard is few, but you notice the pattern of the roof is a whole series of different cut patterns and colors, so that even in that, it's a very painterly approach. And the École des Beaux-Arts style was not just about studying architecture, sculpture, painting independently. It was about studying them all together. And as a student, Richard Morris Hunt created sculpture. He did painting. He was a wonderful draftsman. And that integration of all the arts is reflected in the stick style and that every aspect of the building is completely articulated. Also, similar to the J.N.A. Griswold house, you wouldn't guess it as you come in, but as you come in this entrance, this 3-story tower here is a vertical void inside of the building. So rather than it just being a layer cake of plans, which was sort of the simple pedestrian American approach, now you're starting to see a 3-dimensional articulation of space within the building, so that you have wonderful architectural surprises as you come in, and the ceiling soars up above you 25, 30 feet. Soon thereafter came one of the styles that we practice today as architects. The stick style was paired with the shingle style, and you'll see in the work of McKim, Mead, and White, particularly the Newport Casino, the Isaac Bell House, other houses around town, this articulation of stuff. And that came from a copying the Queen Anne style, which was first promoted in Europe and then brought to the U.S. by H.H. Richardson, and the William Watt Sherman House is one very good example. It will often have a corner tower. It's very asymmetric, which makes it easy to add onto and to enlarge over time. You don't have to add another room on the other side anytime you want to add, just to make the thing symmetrical. And there's lots of wonderful examples of the Queen Anne style, like the Sarah Kendall House, which is now a bed and breakfast. These were called painted ladies. They were very colorful. They had lots of chromatic changes. Typically, you need at least 3, if not 4 colors to properly decorate one of these. You see the articulation. You see the tower, lots of corbels, sometimes contrasting with each other. These are coins, Q-U-O-I-N-S, which are emulating stone in a wood structure. So it's a little bit of a melange. When you think of Victorian architecture, often people are thinking of the Queen Anne style, which was very dominant from 1870 to about 1880. This is a remarkably important building in the Point section. It is by Charles Follen McKim, who brought together two other partners to create the firm of McKim, Mead and White, which went on to become the largest, most prolific firm of the second half of the Gilded Age. But at this time, he was just a relatively small-time architect, spending his summers here and building wonderful little houses in and around the city. And this Bigelow carriage house of 1876, often historians will put the Newport Casino of 1880 as the first true shingle-style building. And it took a lot of the Queen Anne style, but it dialed down the color, it dialed down the decoration. It was a much kind of more painterly approach of using different shingle patterns around the outside to create the visual interest, as opposed to painting it 4 different colors, which was the Queen Anne model. And I'm really beginning to think that this is, if not the first true shingle-style building, awfully close. You know, it's one of these chicken and egg things where it changes just a little bit and it gets away from the previous style and it becomes a new style. I don't think they were thinking in those terms. I don't think he was thinking, I need to invent a new style and it will be called the shingle style. That all came 50, 60 years later when historians looked back at it. But I think he said, well, you know, this is just a carriage house. It needs to be a little simpler. I'm using shingles elsewhere. Why don't I keep using those? But instead of all of these decorative panels and coins and tower, I'll dial all that stuff back. I'll still kind of create a tower element so it doesn't look completely different than everything else I'm doing. But we'll make that into an event space which every carriage house needs. And instead of having a big one in the middle, I'll move it off to the side. So he was creatively taking a style he already was very familiar with and knew well, and just making it a little bit simpler, a little bit cleaner. And you see in this building all of the same elements that will be kind of blossom onto the architectural scene just a few years later with the creation of the Newport Casino, which happened after they brought a young Sanford White on board from H.H. Richardson's office, which apparently was down the hallway from them. Well, the Gilded Age, of course, was a magnificent one that mainly occurred up and down Bellevue Avenue and out along the drive. The Point was seen as a little suburban for that. There weren't any grand mansions. Nobody wanted to be surrounded by lots of little colonial houses. So that work largely occurred elsewhere in Newport, and there'll be other lectures for you once you enter the Circle of Scholars to study that. But here we are in 1945. Newport remains a wonderful deep water port, a great place for Navy to develop its ships and for torpedoes to be made on Goat Island, because that way they're not being, you don't want to build a torpedo and then ship it halfway across the country in the back of a truck bouncing over roads. You want to lift it up and drop it into its conveyance and have it sail neatly away with as little muss and fuss as possible. So Newport became a naval center. Here we have Goat Island and the production of these 25-foot long torpedoes that were rolled around and then craned up and dropped into battleships and submarines. Newport took on great importance during that time as a naval center. But it also had its challenges as well. Soon thereafter, and it was still largely a naval center until 1973. Here we are, I believe this is Hurricane Carol of '54. We talked about how the Blaskowitz map is recreated every time the water rises, and this is an example. We know exactly where this is because we have the brick market and the road continuing down along Long Wharf. And that really became sort of a thriving center. Newport was still very much off the beaten path. The steamship ferries of the Gilded Age had ceased. You could still get to Newport by ferry by first taking the bridge over from the mainland to Jamestown and then taking a ferry across from Jamestown. But it was a quiet enclave kind of off to the side of history until Antoinette Downing and Vincent Scully wrote a book called The Architectural Heritage of Newport, which was a great reminder to architectural scholars everywhere of what an amazing treasury of architecture still existed in Newport, largely through what I call benign neglect. We were never so wealthy to tear them down, at least during that time, and then we were never so poor as to let them completely fall down and become derelict, as happened, let's say, in Detroit and many other places where the pendulum swung too far. So in New York, grand palaces were being torn down after 30 years because a skyscraper needed to go in its place. Elsewhere, mansions just were abandoned and derelict. Newport always stayed, fortunately, on the middle path where it was able to maintain the old architecture well enough to essentially restore it at a later date. And then came the Pell Bridge in 1969. And there were many ideas as to where it should land, but there really is BP and AP, before Pell and after Pell. Newport's life changed rather dramatically, as well as its architecture, based on this very, very modern structure, obviously made out of steel and concrete, and threading its way across Connecticut Island and landing, and where this landed was largely debated among apparently different merchants who wanted the bridge to land on their doorstep as opposed to their neighbor's doorstep. But it did end where it eventually did, and then they said, well, okay, now that all this traffic, it was a mindset of, if you want to be successful, you have to bring as much traffic as you can to your urban area, because the future is the car, and the car is the future. The point was undergoing some very significant challenges, and in stepped lovely Doris Duke, who was tall and athletic and beautiful, and was the richest woman in the world when her father died and she was 15, and she took over his fortune. She wasn't perhaps the happiest person in the world, I don't know, but she did love colonial architecture. And she and Catherine Warren were good friends. It is rumored that they sat down over tea, and it was decided that Catherine would take care of the Gilded Age architecture, and Doris would take care of the colonial architecture. And she set out to start buying houses, fixing them up, not at financial gain in many cases losing money on them, but restoring them and then renting them out to tenants who would take good care of them. And there are now, I believe, about 82 houses in their portfolio that they own and rent, and in many cases taking houses that were literally being held together with string and baling wire. And I've been told that almost all the houses in the Point during the 1950s were all battleship gray, because that was the paint that could be smuggled off the base and used free of charge by the owners of these houses. So it went through a time when it was really being held together by the faintest of threads. And she stepped in, and when she bought 2 or 3 houses at an intersection, other people felt reassured that they could step in and that the neighborhood would be anchored by her credibility and her financial stability. So here's a map of the Point section with all of the different houses there. And then, of course, here is Historic Hill, which also had many of these beautiful old homes that were in somewhat derelict state. Here you have an aerial picture of those 2 neighborhoods, showing the old rail yards that were coming in to the steamship ferry docks here, the remnants of the Point right there, and then the infill of that area, Long Wharf. And then here we have the construction of America's Cup Boulevard, which channeled the traffic off the bridge into the city and split the old Point neighborhood in 2 and tore down about 7 national historic landmarks that were magnificent pieces of architecture. To give you one that was saved is the Clark Cook House, which was relocated to its current location. So if you can imagine, another 6 buildings of similar scale and beauty as the Clark Cook House were lost during this period of urban renewal, when all the chips were put in on the idea of tearing down old neighborhoods and bringing in parking, highways, and other accommodation for the automobile. And here we have the end product of that. It also not only divided the Point from itself, it separated Historic Hill from the wharves, which they had traditionally been connected to. And a big challenge we have now is getting people across that road, those 4 lanes of highway safely. And we lose somebody every 5 or 10 years crossing in front of Bannister's Wharf. But anyway, that is a challenge for another day. We are left with the byproducts of different philosophies of architecture and planning from different eras, and we have to then take that information, take those objects, take that design, and try and translate it into the current era as we develop it. And also you see, in many cases, a lot of these houses were raised up, and the Newport Restoration Foundation is now carrying on the act of taking these old houses and then bringing them back down to the ground where retail had been added underneath to restore them back to their historic character. And I think this is that same house on Marlborough and Thames Street. And of course, the beautiful door cowl with that incredible level of design that is typical of the colonial period, and all of those Quaker craftsmen that when they weren't building beautiful furniture were creating beautiful architectural components for the buildings. Some more modern interpretations here. The point is continuing to grow, but here we have that same Queen Anne style model, but now expanded to the size of a timeshare. Again, another architectural typology which came and went. I don't think they're building many of these now, but you do have a wonderful central corner element, a tower, which would have typically been the stair. Here it's obviously much more shingle elements. So even in the modern architecture we're doing today, we're trying to honor the styles of architecture that were already present in the point and apply them to different forms of architecture that didn't exist previously. There it is, sort of anchoring that corner of Long Wharf and Washington Street from the outside. And here we are looking all the way up to the Colony House, which is the same route that George Washington walked when he disembarked on Long Wharf to meet with Rochambeau as they were planning the march against the British down in Virginia, starting in Newport, starting literally at Washington Square, and then going all the way down along the W3R route to Yorktown, where the ultimate battle was won. Okay, so here we have a graph of the population of largest cities in the United States. And here we are back in 1790. We're already no longer the fifth, but Newport is that red line. So we were bigger than Chicago was nothing at this point. Cleveland, Dallas, Texas, Phoenix, all of these basically were unpopulated areas when Newport was just shy of 10,000. It had been a little bit bigger. And we stayed steady while all of the other cities, and this is a logarithmic graph. So this isn't 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. This is 10,000, 100,000, 1 million, 10 million. So each one of those lines represents a 10 times growth of those cities. And New York just continued to increase. So it had been the largest in 1776 and continued to be, where Newport was fifth and is now 555th. You know, I don't know where we stand today in terms, but we are, we punch above our weight, certainly from an architectural standpoint, because we have these magnificent pieces of architecture from not just the colonial era, but also from the post-colonial era, and you can find them all together in the Point District. We have a